Good afternoon and welcome to the Open Competition SSH seminar. This is my colleague Ilko van Dongen and I am Maudie Lohaus, and we both work at the SSH domain of NWO. Today we will first give you a presentation about the Open Competition SSH in which we will explain a few general characteristics of the round, and after this short presentation you can ask us all your questions. All right, first question. Go to www.menti.com and please use the code 48437993. We would really like to know what is your academic background, so we're waiting for you to share your input with us, to know who is attending this webinar. Great, we already have some replies. Social psychology, psychology, we see literary studies, humanities, history. So many people from different backgrounds. That's great, that's great. Assistant professor, university teacher, I see economics. That is super. Thank you so much for sharing this input. That's great. Yeah, like I said, we have an idea now who's attending and who's watching this. Okay, we're moving on to our next question. If it wants, yes. So the question we have for you is, what subject are you most interested in? We have 4 listed here: the aim of the instrument, application conditions, budget modules, and the assessment criteria. All right, we see assessment criteria. Most people are interested in the assessment criteria, and after that, application conditions. Well, we will talk about all these subjects so that, yeah, all your questions should be answered in a few moments. All right, moving on. So, like I said, I will first give you a short presentation about the NWO Open Competition SSH round. All right, so what is this? What kind of instrument is this? We're funding research proposals across the social sciences and humanities, and the focus is on curiosity-driven, innovative research, and the applicants choose the type of funding required for their research. We have a total of 28.5 million euros available for this round, and as an applicant you can request up until 750,000 euros per application. There are several sections for your application in which you can apply for this subsidy. Those are divided between staff, material costs, knowledge utilization, money follows cooperation and internationalization, and investments. Moving on to our next slide. We aim at experienced researchers who are no longer eligible for the NWO talent scheme. This means that you should be 15 years past your PhD defense at a minimum, and you should have a paid appointment at the moment you apply, and this paid appointment is required for the entire project. You can submit 1 proposal per round, and you cannot submit in successive rounds. And additionally, if you're currently receiving NWO funding, you cannot submit until the last year of your current project, and this holds true for proposals that have received funding after the 25th of September 2018. Why this date? Because this was the first deadline for the first NWO Open Competition SSH round. Moving on. This is our timeline. So we first have a pre-proposal deadline. So the round is divided between a pre-proposal phase and a full proposal phase. And the deadline for the pre-proposals is the 7th of September 2021 at 2 p.m. Central European summertime. Then in November, there's the opportunity for the applicants to reply, or it's the response, so-called response phase for the applicants, following the advice of the selection committee. And then in the second half of December, the domain board will decide which applications go through to the full proposal phase. The full proposal phase deadline is the 15th of February next year in 2022, also with a deadline at 2 p.m., not summertime. And the first half of April next year, the applicants will be able to submit a rebuttal. This rebuttal is a reply to the assessment by the external anonymous reviewers. And at the end of July next year, the domain board will make a final decision about who will receive funding for this instrument. And of course, the applicants will be notified about the outcome. Now, how does this all work? I just mentioned that we have a pre-proposal phase and a full proposal phase. We have two criteria, one of the subjects you're most interested in for the pre-proposal phase, and we have three criteria for the full proposal phase. The two criteria for the pre-proposal phase is, as you can see, the research idea, the first criteria, which weighs in for 70% into the final assessment for this phase, and then the appropriateness of the research team is a 30% for this phase. The idea behind it is that we really want to give the applicants an idea to push forward their research ideas. So we feel that the focus should be on that assessment criteria as far as the way-in into the final assessment goes for this phase. Then we have the full proposal phase, which is divided between the three criteria: scientific quality for 50%, the embedding organization and budget for 30%, and the scientific and/or societal impact for 20%. Then we have 6 assessment panels, and these are divided between the social sciences, etc. You can see them on the pie chart that we're showing you right now. And basically, you have to apply within a panel. Now, if you have any doubts about where you can send in your application, in which panel you should apply for this round, please do contact us through email or by phone to ask us for advice. We are more than willing to give you advice on in which panel it would be best for you to apply. All right, this was our short presentation. So we will now answer all questions that you have. Also, if you have any questions that come up later after this session, you can send them to sgwoc@nwo.nl. All right, Ilko.
Yeah, and so please remember, there might be many questions that come up today. If anything we can't answer, of course, please do still send them afterwards to this email address that Maudi just mentioned, so that we can still answer them, because we are, of course, not sure that we can finish all questions in the available time. We already got a few questions from you, so we'll start answering those. So the first question that's asked, Maudi, is whether it is known who will be in the assessment panels in this scheme.
All right, thank you, Ilko, for that question. We do not yet know who will take part in the assessment committees, because we are, as we speak, still searching for committee members. So this is not yet unknown. But if I'm not mistaken, the composition of the assessment committee will be, of course, communicated to the applicants at some point, but also will be placed on the website after the round is over, is finished, is completed.
Yeah. Another question which was answered, and is something we get quite often actually, is whether the requirement to have a paid position in this scheme can actually be covered by having a temporary contract with an actual supporting statement of the institution saying that you would actually get a paid and solid appointment for the full duration afterwards, and whether this is acceptable. Unfortunately, for those who are asking, this is not acceptable, in the sense that, like Maudi explained, that we do ask applicants to have, at the moment of their submission, this paid appointment for the full duration necessary. So if this is necessary, then this means automatically that just having a support and statement at that point won't be sufficient to cover this. Another question which is meant is, I'll ask this to Maudi, does there's a restriction for project funding, so that you can't have another simultaneous amount of MDO funding going on while you're applying? Does this also apply to WOTRO funding, or is it like only SSH funding, or is it completely covering all of the funding submitted and supplied by NWO?
So if I'm not mistaken, the question is, if you already receive funding from NWO, can you apply for the NWO open competition round?
And whether this is specific to like an SSH program or a WOTRO program, or whether this is actually something that is concerning any NWO project,
yes,
regardless of
where the funding is received, in which part of the organization. All right, so basically the simple answer is any funding you receive from NWO, means that you cannot apply for the NWO Open Competition SSH until you're in the final year of your research project. And like I mentioned during my presentation, this holds true for funding you received after the 25th of September 2018. So if you received funding before this date, you don't have to worry about this specific application criterion.
Another question I can tackle is, there's a question about impact, which is something you mentioned, Maudi, in the for the full proposal phase, but which isn't highlighted in the pre-proposal phase. This is correct, obviously. The question is, what does it mean for proposals who actually focus on, for instance, societal impact in this earlier phase? A good question. I also would like to refer you here to the call, which delineates in more detail what kind of falls in under each of the two criteria in the pre-proposal phase, and actually in the research idea itself also has this idea that relevance and innovativeness, which also can deal with impact, will be considered in this phase, but there is indeed not a specific focus. So in that sense, we would ask you to highlight basically when describe your research idea, what impact and what innovation will come from it, what relevance it will have, and in that sense this will also allow you to describe the impact, but it's not something that has a specific focus. It's a bit broader that we look at the research idea as a whole there. So it's definitely something that you can kind of weave into your description of your research idea, but it's not something that's then separated to the degree that it is in the full proposal phase.
Yeah.
Another question is about the budget. Of course, you mentioned that there's 28.5 million available in total, but there are 6 panels. Can you explain how this is divided? Is there like a split amount which is equally across the panels, or is there something else going on when the money is divided?
Well, I'm not exactly sure about this question, so maybe you can answer it, Ilko. You know this better than I do.
Yes, so I think the really short take-home message here is that we actually look at the number of applications for each panel. So we don't say in advance, well, every panel gets the same amount of money, an equal share of the 28.5 million, but we look at how many applications are men, and then a decision is made based on that, how the division is taking place. So what will happen is that, for instance, say that the panel of philosophy and history and religious studies has 2 times the amount of applications that the other panels get, then this will also be reflected in the amount of money divided. So in that sense, we're kind of responsive to the needs and applications sent in.
Right.
Another question, which is also quite interesting because it's a broad scheme, and maybe Maudi you can answer. Is it discouraged if just one individual applies, or is there always a team necessary?
No, it's not at all discouraged if you apply as an individual without a team behind you. Also, maybe I'm already tackling another question here, I'm not sure, but we also get a lot of questions whether or not it is a good idea or not a good idea to apply for a small budget, so to not apply for the full 750,000 euros that you can apply for. The committee looks at the content of your proposal, so whether or not it's done individually, whether or not you request 30,000, 40, 100,000, if your research idea can be executed within this budget according to the committee, and if you can do that individually, then it's no problem for the committee, and this is not discouraged at all.
Another question we get, and this is also something which is we hear often, whether it's possible to have a co-applicant from outside the Netherlands. And this is indeed possible. You might have noticed that the discussion in terms of what can be applied for also discussed the money for cooperation budget module. And this module is specifically designed to allow you to apply for a project in which part of it is executed outside the Netherlands. If you apply for this model, you can, for instance, apply for funding for, say, a PhD student in Germany or some other country that you would like to cooperate with. And then in that case, you can also list one of the local researchers as a co-applicant, and this is actually required in that point. Important note here is that this co-applicant should then also meet the criteria for applicants, apart from the fact, obviously, that he or she should not have to be localized in the Netherlands, but otherwise should also be one of those researchers who are on the experience side with this, without having eligibility for the talent scheme anymore. But then in that case, if you do wish to cooperate, this would be a construction which allow you to cooperate and have co-applicants from outside the Netherlands. Another question about partners, whether applicants are supposed to actually mention people who are actually not co-applicants but will cooperate in some way in the pre-proposal. Is this something that we recommend or something that we require, or whether people are free to choose their own way in this?
Okay, so it's not required to mention team members. It is required to mention co-applicants. It's not required to mention team members. Of course, if you already know you have a team behind you, then of course mention it, because the more complete your proposal is, the better. But it's not a criteria to already mention the team members. If you, for example, come up with people you want to work with later on, for example, you're through to the full proposal phase and you know that you want to cooperate with other researchers, and you did not know yet at the pre-proposal phase, you can add them later on in your full proposal in the research team category. So this is not a requirement.
Yeah, and I think a similar question which kind of connects to this is whether you should already mention, if you have a PhD position in your project and you have someone in mind for this position, whether you should mention them. This is also not a requirement. You can do so, and sometimes it can make it a bit more insightful for a committee how a project will be executed, but it's definitely not a requirement. So you can, and you're free to do so, but if there's no candidate yet available, or you're not sure yet, or you have to have an application process after the project is funded, this is also fine. So that's up to your own discretion in this particular instance. Of course, one question we often get is whether something fits into the open competition scheme. And a question here specifically was whether research into cognitive functioning in medical diagnosis fit the criteria or fit the instrument. Don't know if you have anything to add specifically based on this tidbit of information, but anything you would like to say about that maybe?
If it would fit within the NWO open competition, I would think it would fit between or in the the behavior and
the behavior and education
panel, yeah. Or the specifically behavior and education, I think.
Probably.
Yeah.
I think it's of course very hard for us to, at the moment, based on a simple sentence, come up with a really direct advice. But like Maudi already mentioned, we can of course, if you phone us or send an email, we can come up with a bit more detailed reply. Yeah. And definitely do that if you do consider applying. And of course, you might be aware that there's different instruments across NWO, for instance, in the science domain, or colleagues at the medical science at Zon MW. These might also be good fits for your project. But do approach us for more information. So, of course, we can't say for sure, but we always can advise you to the best of our ability, and then you can make the best informed choice in that regard. There's a question whether funding from the Dutch National Science Agenda is considered to be NWO funding, and I guess, and basically in terms of NWO funding, this is actually the same, so we would consider that also NWO funding. Yeah. So if you have ongoing funding from the Nationale Wetenschapsagenda or like in English, the Dutch National Science Agenda, this would also count towards this restriction. Let me look. There's also a question here. Is there anything you can tell us about the composition of the assessment panels?
Yeah, so we look at different disciplines. So, for example, within law and public administration, we look specifically for political scientists, for different experts in the field of law. So, private law, business law, public law, for all different kinds of expertise. Within the panels, we look for different experts. So it's not just, for example, within social sciences panel that we just look for one specific expertise, but we look for different scientists to have a broad background of expertise within these different assessment panels, so they can assess many different applications coming from different academic backgrounds.
And related to this, we also got the question whether there are some kind of limits or restraints in terms of their seniority. Do we look for professors? Do we look for people who can actually commit to both the full and the pre-proposal phase? Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we generally look for more senior researchers to take part in the assessment committees, but we do not exclude less senior committee members. So we try to make we try to make the assessment committee more senior, but we do not exclude younger senior or less senior, academic researchers. We try to make an equal division kind of between seniority and expertise.
Mm-hmm. So there's a specific question about the pre-proposal form where people are asked in section 3C to list output, and the question is, should you describe them or just list them? I think the important question is here, because it also has to do with the word limit, where the question also deals with the output itself. Say if you want to list a publication or a software package or something else that you would want to provide as terms of output of these selected 5 things, then this is something that you can actually list, and this does not count towards your word limit for this section. At the same time, if you want to describe in more detail how this is relevant and how this is a good way of showing that the research team is fit for purpose, so to say, then this would count towards your part. So the specific listing of the items itself does not count towards it, but further description does. I think that's the line here. There's a question what actually the budget for investment means. Do you want to take this, or should we? We can basically, you can go different ways with this. The investment module is something you can actually use to fund investments, as the name says, into the creation of data sets or equipment. So say you want research equipment, which is something that you really need for the execution of your research. You can actually use this module to apply for this. It also allows you, for instance, if you're thinking about digitizing some data that you have, or if you require technical expertise to help you setting up a data set or to create some local infrastructure. So this is basically the type of scheme that allows you to do so. And of course, it's quite relevant then to make clear how this is relevant and what actual the scientific contribution could be later on. But it's kind of broad in range. So it can be equipment, it can be personnel, it can be data sets, and everything related to that. And this will allow you to then to basically go further and improve the local infrastructure for your research. Another question is what the success rate is in the pre-proposal phase and the full proposal phase broadly.
I'm not really sure about that. What is it like?
So I think the main thing to take home here is that it really depends also on the number of applications we get in the first phase. So we will generally aim for say 2 times the amount of funded proposals to be selected. I think that's an important thing. But yeah, so last year's usually this meant that if you really look at how many of the pre-proposals in the end in the second phase got funding, this was between 15 to 20%. And that meant that for the pre-proposals that were selected, they got between 30 and 40% chance of actually getting funding after developing their pre-proposal. So, of course, the competition is fierce, but in this way we do hope with the scheme to allow people who really invest the time into developing their proposal into a full proposal to have a decent shot at getting their funding in the end. The other question is, there's a restriction on how often you can apply, and one of the things you mentioned was not in successive rounds. And the question is, does this also apply to pre-proposals?
Yes, this also applies to pre-proposals. So if you submitted a pre-proposal last year that didn't go through to the full proposal phase, you cannot submit an application this year.
Another question I see here is, whether there's any type of different treatment smaller and larger proposals get, and whether they have a different type of success rate in this competition.
They do not get a different treatment. They do not have a different success rate, if I'm correct. No, I don't think. And so, yeah, they compete with larger applications. But like I mentioned earlier, the committee really looks at the content of your proposal. So if your proposal fits within this budget and it looks good, so to speak, then yeah, you have a chance. It's not that they immediately dismiss smaller proposals with a smaller budget.
Another question which I can answer straight away is, there's a question whether people can apply with a co-applicant who is still him or herself eligible for a VENI or a VD proposal. And it's important to realize that the restrictions mentioned for applicants basically concern both main and co-applicants. So also your co-applicant cannot be someone who is still eligible for the talent scheme. So unfortunately, no people who are still eligible for a VENI or a VD grant.
So maybe it's good to give a little bit of background information on the target group, so to speak, for this round. So we have the talent scheme that's available for younger and middle, senior and senior researchers, and the domain board obviously made a choice based on also the amount of applications we can handle, and of course on the group that was not yet being served, and that is the more senior group that can no longer apply to the talent scheme, which is also one of the main reasons why this instrument exists for senior researchers, so those who are more than 15 years past their PhD defense date.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to realize. Some choices have to be made, of course, and this is, I think, the decision that's now here. And yeah, so that does mean, unfortunately, some people cannot apply, but it does mean that this is a very targeted instrument with a specific purpose in this regard. Another question is whether if you submit a pre-proposal and it's rejected in that phase, can people still go against this and still submit a full proposal, or whether they are out of the race, so to say?
Yeah, so there's a response period that I just told you about in November of this year. So the first deadline is in September, and then in November, around that period, the applicants have the opportunity to reply or give a response to the advice that the committee gives, whether or not they can actually go to the full proposal phase. And eventually the domain board does make a decision whether or not this is accepted, this reply, and that you can still go through to the full proposal phase, or whether or not the response isn't cutting the deal, so to speak, and you cannot go through to the full proposal phase.
Yeah. I think there were a few questions which kind of deal with the issue of whether there's any requirements for multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. So does that give you a bonus, or is this required? I think in general it's good to take home here from this session that the open competition is really open, so there's no thematic restrictions, which also means that there's no requirement to do something either monodisciplinary or multidisciplinary. It's something you can make your own choice in this regard. So there's also no bonus for doing so. However, I think the correct people correctly observe that you do have to choose for a panel, which means that the actual choice does make it sometimes a bit more difficult to find out where your proposal would fit best. Again, if you have any doubts about where it would fit best, we would ask you to contact us and we would help you. We are very committed to make sure that your proposal fits in best with the correct panel. At the same time, if you look at what's required in terms of assessment, say for instance, is that you work with different disciplines in your research team? There's no such thing, but the committee will look at whether the kind of problems you want to study, the type of research you want to investigate, whether this actually connects well with the appropriateness of the associated research team. So if you want to tackle a topic which is by its nature interdisciplinary, of course, then the committee would expect you to also tackle this from the multiple directions. So that's important to realize that in the end, basically the most important thing is to connect your research idea with the appropriate team, regardless whether it is monodisciplinary or multidisciplinary.
Right.
Another question is whether applications across institutions, so whether you have, for instance, multiple PIs from different institutions, whether this is possible.
Multiple PIs from different institutions.
Say if you have an applicant from Utrecht University and one from the Erasmus University, is this allowed?
Yeah, this is allowed. Yeah, this is allowed. It's a short answer.
Yeah, but clear. Yeah, good question. Let me see. Some of the questions have been answered. A question, of course, also relevant is for people who do get selected for the full proposal, can they make changes in their research idea or their pre-proposal when they develop it into the full-fledged proposal?
Well, the main thing you have to consider here is that you shouldn't submit an entirely different proposal. So it should, of course, be linked to your pre-proposal, but you can make, tiny adjustments to it, as long as they're not largely impacting the general research proposal, the general idea that you submitted in the pre-proposal phase.
Moving on.
And thank you so much for all your questions, by the way.
Yeah, so it's really, we're still ongoing. There's a huge list. So again, if I skipped your question for whatever reason, please do send it again if you feel that it hasn't been answered to some of the other questions that have been discovered and discussed. There's a question whether it's any problem that if you have team members, so no applicants, if they are still eligible for the talent scheme. Does that matter at all?
So co-applicants should not be eligible for the talent scheme. Team members, it doesn't matter really. So if you if your co-applicant is still eligible for the talent scheme, you cannot put them as a co-applicant in your application, but they can be part of your research team. That is no problem.
Mm-hmm. Another question is whether we have the whole procedure and then whether the use of English is required in all phases, or whether people can submit in Dutch or perhaps even other languages.
It's a full English round.
Another question is, and maybe that relates to the comment I made earlier, whether since there are different open competition instruments at NWO, whether you can actually submit to, for instance, the open competition in science as well as the social science and humanities, like the current scheme we're discussing today. This is possible. There's no mutually exclusive conditions, apart from the fact that, again, if you do get funded and you want to submit afterwards, it does count as NWO funding. So if you do get an open competition science project funded, for instance, this is of course then an ongoing project which might prevent you from submitting future applications in the current scheme. Another thing is that in general, NWO will never fund the same research twice for obvious reasons. So if you do submit, for instance, exactly the same proposal and you would get it funded by some, kind of unlikely turn of events, then you will actually have to choose at the moment that the funding is awarded, because you cannot, of course, get double the funding for doing the same work. But yeah, that's just more of a formal thing. Let's say... the question is, if you do ask for appropriateness of the team, that's one of the criteria in the pre-proposal, does that then change anything if you do submit it as an individual? Or how will we deal with it then?
So if you do not describe a research team?
So if your research team consists basically of one person, say in the most simple case, is the assessment different from if you would do it as if you do submit as a full team with many different co-researchers?
Yeah. Okay, so no, it doesn't make a difference. What you have to keep in mind, basically the answer is always the same when these questions come up, is that the assessment committee really looks at is the proposal a full, does it embody everything it should embody? So did you think about different disciplines? For example, if it's interdisciplinary, like Ilko just said, did you add a certain expert to your team who has knowledge of a discipline that you don't as an applicant have the knowledge of? So if you apply as an individual and you add one team member, this is not a problem at all. But yeah, just keep in mind that the assessment committee does look at the entire proposal that you submit. So whether or not this can actually be successful if you add one team member instead of an entire team. So yeah, it also depends on, like I said, the interdisciplinarity of your research, the largeness of your research, if it's small or if it's a very big research. It depends on all these kinds of things. It should be a good fit within the application. Yeah.
Very important points. A very practical question is whether the full proposal format will be available before December when the results are made available. We do intend to do this actually, so we do hope to produce this format for your use and information in the coming fall, so that it will be available before you actually get the results, so that you need to have a bit more time to work towards it if you do desire. Another question is, it was related specifically to the Dutch science agenda, but more generally, I think it's good to clarify whether it makes a difference if you have funding ongoing, whether you're a co-applicant or a project leader or a main applicant. The main distinction is that if you are a main applicant or project leader, this would count towards being your project and therefore your funding. And if you're a co-applicant, basically this is not exclusionary. So you can actually then submit. So if you are not the main applicant of the grant under consideration, then that doesn't apply basically this restriction of current ongoing NWO funding. So that makes it a bit more clear. So only the project leaders of these grants and the main applicants will actually be excluded based on the funding. And if you're in some other way involved, this doesn't exclude you from the open competition program.
And maybe here to add to what you just said is that you should realize that if you have been a co-applicant in the previous round, you cannot apply for this round. Yeah. So in that sense, it does make a difference whether or not you're a co-applicant.
That's a very good distinction indeed. So for this exactly within the scheme, it does make a large difference. So then co-applicants are treated basically the same as the main applicants in terms of eligibility, but also in terms of exclusion in successive rounds. Another question which actually follows nicely from this, if your pre-proposal gets accepted but you decide to withdraw yourself for whatever reason, does that mean that you cannot resubmit? This does mean that you cannot resubmit in general, but if there is very specific personal circumstances that prevent you from developing your proposal, then you can also discuss it with us and we can then see if there's an individual solution we can come to. It can of course also be typical situations that just prevent you and that actually don't that are basically something that we can actually take into account, and we can then for instance see if you can submit another year or we can find some other solution. So we do want to look for a solution in those cases, but typically if it's your own choice that you withdraw, then that means that it counts and you cannot submit in the next round. Let's see. How soon do you have to start a project if it gets funded? Can you say anything
within 6 months, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, you look at it.
I'm not exactly sure. Within 6 months after receiving your funding, yeah. So.
Yeah, and that's basically a typical NWO rule. So it's basically no different than for other things. The question is whether it is possible to have co-funding.
Yes, it's possible to have co-funding. Yeah.
Yeah, that's short and sweet. Of course, a question. We mentioned that there is a criteria in the full proposal phase, which deals with scientific and/or societal impact. And the question that raises is then, is there preference for any of the two? Or can people choose? Or
yes, okay. Great question, because we can understand this might be a bit confusing, but it specifically says and/or, so you can choose between scientific impact and societal impact. However, do motivate why you make this choice, because that is very important and that is what the committee will look for. And also to actually make explicit how you're going to deal with unforeseen chances in the future of how do I say this, engaging or executing societal or scientific impact. So make a choice. You can make a choice, and then explain why you make this choice, and then also explain how you plan to deal with unforeseen chances of societal impact and/or scientific impact in the future.
Yeah, so I think the background to this, and this is also something that's implemented currently NWO more widely, is that we want to offer you a bit more freedom in where you focus your attention in terms of impact, but at the same time we want to have you keep an open mind and open eyes basically throughout the execution for unforeseen chances, so that your project also has some measures in place that, for instance, allow you to adapt to the ongoing circumstances and make use of these opportunities. Because we think this is very important to have your science have the best impact. And whether it's a society or scientific doesn't matter, but we do want you to keep an open mind towards such opportunities.
Yeah, can I just add some more to this, what you just said? I think that what's also important is that, because we often see that scientists do not make a choice, so they focus on both forms of impact, which is of course not wrong. But if you do feel like you explicitly would like to focus on a specific form of impact, there is no reason to not do this, as long as you can explain why you decide to focus on one specific form of impact.
Yeah. But it's again, if you have any questions, please answer us. If there's particular focuses you want to explore in your project, you do contact us for more information. There's some questions about how many applicants are required and whether it's required to have any applicants. So basically,
co-applicants, you mean?
Yeah, good correction. So co-applicants are not required. Basically, in most situations, the only time where co-applicants are required if you do work with a foreign collaborator, basically. So if you work for someone in an international research team, to the Money Follows Cooperation module, then it is required. In all other circumstances, there's no requirement. And you can have as many or as few as you want. So there's no restrictions there. And there's no particular focus on listing people either as co-applicants or team members. So it's basically depends on your own preferences in that sense. And this actually, I think I will add this to this. The question is the research team then only the applicants or other people? The research team is basically anybody involved in any capacity in executing the research or supporting your research. So these are, of course, the applicants. We assume they are involved. This can be staff that actually executes the research in terms of, say, a PhD student or a postdoctoral student or research assistant. But it can also be your collaborators nationally and internationally. So it's basically anybody who contributes in that sense.
Can I add to this? Because it might be confusing for people if you say that the research team also includes co-applicants. So we do want to make clear that if you do not mention a research team member as a co-applicant, then they do not count as co-applicants, basically. So in the sense of the criteria to submit a proposal, keep in mind that if you're just a research team member, then you can those criteria of submitting your proposal do not count for you. So it does not count as a submission to the open competition if you're a research team member, to make it clear. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I think in this, to stay kind of on the same topic, there's a question whether team members are paid at different institutions. So of course we discussed previously that you can apply for a project which is executed at different research institutions within the nation or outside, internationally if you prefer. And what happens basically is that the main applicant of your proposal will be responsible for the financial administration of your product. And if there's any staff assigned to other universities, this main applicant will be also responsible for distributing the funding. So the funding will primarily go to one person to start with, but then depending on where the research is executed and the people actually get their appointments, it's redistributed. So that's kind of how it works. So you do get the same salary within the Netherlands because we are using the global tariffs of the Organization of Universities that are kind of a straight NWO feature that we use everywhere, but they will be provided to the institutions that actually give out appointments to, for instance, the PhD students that participate in your research. Let's see. I think there's many things already answered. There's a question on seniority. It's not completely clear, but if it's about seniority in the assessment committee, do we look, for instance, at their titles only, or do we look at how long they have been working in research?
Yeah, we look at publications, we look at, or I should say output, and we look at seniority in the sense of titles. But if you have a title and your output is, like 10 years ago, then generally this can impact whether or not we would ask you for a committee. So
so it's a bit broader than that. It's not like a professor, so can be excluded. We look at the full picture. Yeah. And this also means, I think you already explained, that we can sometimes also ask people who are a bit more junior if they feel that they are a good fit with the panel. But we will definitely look at just the relevant expertise for every panel. Yeah. So that's a broader say. Another question is, when we evaluate a CV or the researcher team, is there like particular attention to the main applicant, or do we look at the whole team?
Yeah, we look at the whole team. Of course, we look at the what I said, like if the expertise that's available within the team, within the applicants, if that can support the research idea, the research proposal, that is what's being looked at, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Is it possible to, for instance, include a PhD student if you have already somebody working on a project? Can these be employed on the project that you apply for in the open competition? And I think that really depends on the situation, I think. Generally, if you ask, for instance, for funding for a PhD position, this is a new project-based position. So we generally want you to then also have like a candidate who starts basically at the beginning of this project. There are scenarios feasible where this is a bit different, but generally any staff that you apply for is related specifically to the product you apply for. So that if something is already ongoing, you cannot ask for funding specifically again for the same work or for continuation of this work. But that's kind of the important thing. So any new positions come for a new project, I think, is the most direct way to answer that question. I think this is most of the things that have been answered so far. We still have a few minutes left. So is it possible to ask for funding? I'm going really into the details now, but is it possible to ask for funding for a 5-year PhD student? This is indeed possible. That will, of course, mean that it's not a full-time position. So basically what we allow with the current system is that people asking for PhD students can choose to either have a 0.8 full-time equivalent position for 5 years, and then the other boundary would be 4 years full-time. So of course more than full-time would not be appropriate, but we can also not allow PhD positions, for instance, for 3 years or for 6 years. Particular cases can be, of course, discussed, but this is kind of the broad scheme of things here. And whether this affects the success rate was a subsequent question here. It does not. Again, I think Maudi explained again, we look at the whole picture, and what would be necessary for the project determines whether this would be a bonus or a bad thing. So if it actually connects well with the kind of type of setup of your project to have a 5-year position, this would of course not be taken as a bad thing. But again, the committee will decide whether this is the case. So we cannot say anything in terms of this will always be good or always be bad, but it should fit the type of project that you apply for. Let's see. I think we're actually getting to the point that most of the questions have been answered, and some very specific questions have been answered that are best answered in a fuller setting where you either phone us or send us a mail detailing it. One question was also whether the new Mosaic program counts as NWO funding, and again, this would, because it's still a program executed by NWO. So if you are actually receiving a Mosaic grant or you're applying for one, this may influence your opportunities for applying to the open competition scheme. Is there anything you would still want to add or give the viewers?
Well, what I would like to add is maybe repeat what I said, is that if you apply for the open competition, please keep in mind, like I said before, that we look at we don't look, but the assessment committee looks at the entire proposal and at the expertise that's available to execute the research. And if you thought of this, if you thought of that, so it's the full picture that the assessment committee and the external reviewers look at. So yeah, keep that in mind when you apply for this round. And yeah, I don't think there's anything else I would like to add. Is there anything that you would like to say as a final note?
No, not really. I see there are 2 short questions I can answer before I think we can conclude.
Okay.
The question is whether, since it is an instrument for across the social sciences, humanities, you should incorporate both. This is not the case. So it can be, of course, an option if you do want to. If you feel it's necessary, if you feel it's useful, you can. But it's not a requirement. You can focus on an area within either the social sciences or the humanities. And it's indeed also possible to ask for part-time positions for postdocs. So there's limits. So there's, I think the bottom is a half a full-time equivalent position for, I think, a year. But there's definitely opportunities for postdocs. They are a bit more flexible in terms of that, in terms of positions and length of positions compared to the PhD situation. Otherwise, yeah, I think most of the questions have been answered. Once more, if you have any other questions or you want more details, a bit more explanations, do contact us to the email address provided on the screen.
Yeah, send us an email to sgwoc@nwo.nl or phone us. Our phone numbers are in the call for proposals. They're not listed here, but they're in the call, so you can also call us. I'm there full-time, and Ilko's almost full-time there. So we should be able to, at some point, answer your questions. So thank you so much for all your questions, for your attendance, and have a nice weekend.